In a move that set the emotional tone for the trial, the prosecution called as its first witness Tiffany's mother, Deweese Unick. Unick began by talking about the happy life she shared with Tiffany up until her daughter's death.
It was Deweese and her daughter against the world. She was a single mom who was raising her daughter on her own, and she had a very, very tight bond with Tiffany. The day after Tiffany's murder, and Lionel turned to Deweese and said that he would like to have Tiffany's toys, and he would like to live with Deweese since Tiffany was not going to be coming home anymore.
Fedowitz believed this may have been one of Lionel's reasons for killing Tiffany. The next day, the state presented one of its most anticipated pieces of evidence, the videotape in which Lionel reenacted the events surrounding Tiffany's death. The video had actually been made by the defense to show that Lionel had accidentally hurt Tiffany. But the prosecution would now use it to bolster its own case and to preempt the so-called wrestling defense. But according to the prosecution, the actions Lionel demonstrated in the video could in no way account for the severe trauma the girl had suffered. To drive this point home for the jury, the state showed a computer graphics display detailing Tiffany's injuries.
The forces that would be used to inflict these injuries were equal to falling out of a second or third floor building. So these were tremendous injuries. This was not an accident. This was a homicide.
The prosecution went on to argue that in his initial statements to authorities, Lionel hadn't even mentioned many of the details he described in the video, including anything about professional wrestling. As proof, the state called to the stand Michael Brannon, a court-appointed psychologist, and by coincidence, a former pro wrestler himself, who interviewed Lionel 3 times following his arrest.
There was no throwing her into a pole. There was no accidentally stepping on her. It was a very simple story about 2 kids playing, one kid falling and another kid tripping over her.
On Thursday, January 18th, after 3 days of testimony, the prosecution rested. The following Monday, defense attorney Jim Lewis began presenting his version of events. Lewis called to the stand forensic pathologist Dr. John Maricini. Maricini testified that the wrestling moves Tate claimed to be imitating could have caused the injuries described in Tiffany's autopsy. However, on cross-examination, Maricini admitted that the injuries were too severe to have been inflicted accidentally.
That was very, very damaging because there you had a defense expert basically saying, yes, it wasn't an accident. It could not have been an accident. So that was I think that really hurt the defense.
On January 23rd, the defense called its final witness, Lionel Tate's mother, Kathleen Grosset Tate. Grosset Tate went on to say that she had no idea Lionel had been involved in Tiffany's death. Under cross-examination, however, the prosecution challenged Grosset Tate's story, arguing that she was fully aware her son had done something wrong. Fedowitz pointed out that paramedics had seen Grosset Tate turn over a blood-stained pillow in what the state maintained was an attempt to clean up the crime scene. Fedowitz also questioned Grosset Tate about the sounds Tiffany had made earlier that evening. The state argued that they were actually the girl's cries for help, and that Grosset Tate ignored them. On January 25, 2001, the trial of Lionel Tate drew to a close. The fate of the 13-year-old boy was now in the hands of a jury. The verdict and the dramatic aftermath are next. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree as charged in the indictment.
7 weeks later, on March 9th, Lionel Tate returned to court for sentencing. In Florida, a first-degree murder conviction carries a mandatory life sentence.
Incarceration for your natural life.
Prosecutor Ken Padowitz also felt the sentence was too harsh.
I realized that Tiffany Unick had justice, but I made no secret by the fact that I found life in prison with no parole inappropriate as a sentence.
In September 2003, the case made its way to a federal appeals court in West Palm Beach. 3 months later, the court handed down its ruling. Lionel Tate's competency, it said, had not been evaluated prior to his trial. Therefore, he should be granted a new trial. To avoid yet another emotional trial, prosecutor Ken Padowitz again offered a plea bargain to Lionel Tate. The deal called for Tate to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for the 3 years in prison he had already served, 1 year of house arrest, and 10 years probation.
It was the same exact plea offer that I had engineered 3 years earlier. Lionel Tate had a second bite at the apple.
This time, Tate, now a tall, thin 16-year-old, accepted the offer. To both those who had supported Tate and many of those who had helped convict him, his release was a welcome end to a tragedy that nearly claimed a second life.
In May 2005, less than a year and a half into his 10 years of parole, Lionel Tate was arrested for robbing a pizza delivery man at gunpoint. His probation was revoked, and he was returned to prison to await trial on the new charges. For American Justice, I'm Bill Curtis.